So, Faye, we have had an interesting, call it 2 weeks in the mortgage industry. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? Tell us a little bit about that. And then I have some questions for you about some programs.
All right. Finally seeing some relief in the rate game, let's say. So inflation, as we all know, came down the last couple of weeks. When inflation comes down, the rates come down with it. So we're now looking somewhere in the mid sixes, which is great considering they were in the low sevens a couple of weeks ago. So things are moving in the right direction. So hopefully inflation will stay low and these rates will, we'd like to see them back in the fives in the next few months, but I guess we'll see what happens coming down the road.
And so when you mentioned mid sixes, is that for everyone or maybe someone with like above a 680 credit score? Are they looking a little lower?
It gets a little complicated because there's something called loan level price adjustments, LLPAs, which means they give you a basic rate. So your rate's whatever, 6.6, let's call it. But then there's adjustments, whether if your credit score is below a 740, there's an adjustment for that. If it's a condo, there could be an adjustment, a multifamily, a second home. So those all price adjustments. That's why it's always hard to come up with a rate without looking at the scenario. But the better your credit is, the better your rate can be. And then there's FHA rates, which are always lower than conventional rates. So FHAs, you're probably looking in the low sixes. You might be able to squeak out a 599 on an FHA mortgage. But I would say generally the rates are somewhere in the mid sixes.
Wow. So FHA might be able to squeak it just under 6. And we touched on it just briefly last week. That is a difference of $300 a month in buying power.
Depends on the loan amount. Absolutely.
Yeah,
it's a big number.
That was for the median price point for the state of Connecticut, which is $368 and change. Yep. So right about
a big number,
bucks.
Especially from a year ago when they were 275. So you went from 275. I mean, at one point the rate was 7.5. So to go from 275 to 7.5 on that price point, it's like $700. I can get you an exact number on it, but it's a big difference.
Absolutely.
So, Faye, should we be cheering? So what happened was last, 2 weeks ago, they dropped the whole point because basically the government came out and said, hey, we did better with inflation than what they were before, right? So
going to be doing worse, right?
Right. So is that kind of like what could happen? Is that like the only way, so if I'm showing a buyer a house, right, and they're like, well, what do you think about the rates? And I can explain to them, well, this is the reason why they dropped the point. So you can say it's the elections, you can say that the inflation did a little bit better, but is that really going to be the main factor of what is going to drive?
Well, the main factor of the increase. Now, again, everything affects the rates, right? So it's not just inflation. So again, we get those questions all the time. What do we think the rate's going to be? No one knows. Like literally, no one knows. Mm-hmm. So what I always tell people, listen, if you're comfortable with a 6.6, and then here's the question: would you be more madder, I should say, if you wait a week and the rate goes to 7, or you wait a week and the rate goes to 6? Yeah, it's always that tough conversation because everyone wants to know what are the rates going to do, what are the rates going to do, and no one knows. So 2 weeks ago, I had no idea the rate's going to drop almost a full point. It's impossible to know that stuff ahead of time. Right. And a lot of times these rates they're already baked in. So in other words, when the Fed increased the rate, that's 75 basis points 3 weeks ago, the rate was already baked in for that. So in other words, rates were going up anticipating that the Fed was going to increase the rate. So a lot of times, the public gets a notice today, hey, the Fed is increasing the rate by 3/4 point. I get the phone calls. What are rates doing? What are rates doing? They stayed the same. They basically didn't move because over the week before that, they gradually went up, anticipating the Fed increasing the rate. So it is a complicated question, and I don't know how to answer it, if I'm being honest. It's just, what are you comfortable with at this point? I always say, listen, if you lock in today, you can always refinance if they go down. That's always an option for you. So if they do go down to the 5s, and you're in the mid sixes, you're going to always want to refinance and take advantage of that lower rate.
So Brian, does it have the reverse effect? So if we're anticipating the Fed lowering the rates, do we start to see the mortgage rates tick down as well too, or will they go to start to tick up? So no matter what, in anticipation of whenever the Fed's going to vote, we will see a little bit of a downtick there.
You should, yeah. Remember when the Fed's rate was 0, I get those calls. So the interest rate's 0. I'm like, well, they're not 0, but they're heading in the right direction, but they're never going to be 0. But yeah, that's a good point. So in other words, if they're talking about the Fed's going to drop the rate 0.75 point, we'll see the week before the rate slowly tick down, and then again, same thing. I'll get the call. Hey, did rates drop 3/4 of a point? No, they've been dropping over the past week, and it's never even to even. Meaning, if the Fed drops at 3/4 of a point, we're not getting 3/4 of a point better. We might get a 0.5 point or 0.4%. So it all depends on the market and everything else like that.
Now, if I had someone on the contract 2 weeks ago and we're going to be closing in 60 days, and all of a sudden, so when they locked in, they were in the 7s, and all of a sudden the next day, the rate drops to in the mid 6s. Can they take that, or are they locked in with that rate?
If you're locked, you're locked. Yeah. So the same thing. I'll say, hey, if the rates went up 0.5 point, and I went back to him like, hey, we locked you at 6.5, but now they're at 7. We're going to put you at 7. Everyone wants the better of the two. But if I'm being honest, you're not. You can leave. You can go to a different lender. You can do whatever. You're not. It's not like we sign a contract. Right. So it has happened where, hey, at the time I got you the best rate I could get you. The rates dropped. You get a call from someone else giving you another rate, and they're going to go with the other person. And it does happen.
It's just the game.